Welcome to the Leveling Up Your Permaculture Practice Virtual Summit. This year we focused our theme on permaculture business, right livelihood, and regenerative business design. In this presentation, we are featuring yet again Javan Brnjakovic and his presentation called Facing Fire, Designing Fire-Resilient Homesteads and Farms. Javan says, quote, living in a biological world with financial limitations, I have made it my mission to create ecologically sound yet productive landscapes. A skilled practitioner in providing peace of mind, I work collaboratively with homesteaders, organizations, and families, creating regenerative landscapes and livelihoods. That's a very short bio, folks. You can check out a longer one with Javan's other presentation. Javan, great to have you back again. Thanks for being here.
You're most welcome, sir. Pleasure to be chatting with you again.
Yeah, and we're kind of threading in this whole fire piece because, just to break it up from business, but we also want to tie the whole idea of designing fire-resilient landscapes into a business offering, potentially. So if you do happen to have a design install business out there and you're in fire-prone landscapes, this might be something that you could offer as a service. So that's kind of the frame. But Javan, tell us a little bit, if you can, just about your experience. Like, I know you have a fair amount of experience with fire resilient design. You've also created a documentary about it as well. I'm not familiar with it. So just give us an overview of your understanding, your experience with designing for fire resilience.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to develop a documentary, and my brother's an amazing cinematographer and award-winning filmmaker. And he found out about this opportunity for funding, and he reached out to me. He said, hey, let's do a documentary about permaculture. And the grant was going to come in about like November, and you had to be finished by March. And winter is not a particularly photogenic time of year for permaculture in the northern climes. And so I thought about it for a while. And what I came to, because in British Columbia and northwestern North America and the world over, we're seeing a lot of issues when it comes to wildfires. And I thought, what if we took this major problem and used it as a gateway to learn about more regenerative, ecologically informed solutions to improve resiliency against wildfire, or potentially even prevent wildfires that are destructive to facility areas, human inhabited areas, things like that. So he signed on. He ended up getting a lot of work and wasn't very much part of the project. So if there's any shaky material in the film, it's definitely mine for sure, because I'm not a cinematographer. I don't play one on the internet. So we made this documentary. I made this documentary, Facing Fire, Building Resiliency to Wildfire. And in it, we traced the beginning, the middle, and the end in terms of where we are today, in terms of what is the wildfire situation we're in, how did we get here, how do we get ourselves out of it. And what's interesting is that when our ancestors colonized North America, indigenous population had an exceptional relationship. Some of the indigenous population had an exceptional relationship with fire and with applying fire on landscapes. There's this idea of you don't get to choose if there's fire on the landscape, you only get to choose when. So there was a lot of indigenous, cultural, slow and low intensity fires. We won't call them prescription burns because that's something we use in terms of common nomenclature when it comes to firefighting and laying prescription fire. But there was individuals for millennia that were doing these incredible, like very intelligent, very scientific, you would say, application of fire. The Yurok tribe in the Kalamalka, up in northwestern California, there were stories of when it was too cold or too hot. Sometimes when there was an inversion, they would light fire so that way the stream bed would be laced with this thick blanket of fire smoke to insulate the creek, so that way the salmon could still spawn. That level of intelligence, that level of detail was one, not known to anybody else, nor did I think those people care. And two, we still don't know today. So when we imported people from all around the world into North America, we also imported the Germanic forestry systems, which are not compatible with the type of forests that we had in North America. So we ended up with monster slash piles, that slash being the refuse left over from a clear cut, that we still haven't seen today because of the size and the density of the forests. And generally, forests would come through a number of fire forest ecosystems perennially. So Many forests have a prescription from a scientific perspective today in terms of when fire will come throughout that forest. And you can see that within a healthy forest because of the stand density, the vegetation growth, the permeability from just sightline, how deep you can see into the forest. All of these were attributes or metrics in which you could gauge how dense is this forest and what's the issues. Once we get into major clear cutting, we get into major forest fires because now we have railways that are going into deep forest. Railways leave sparks, sparks spark up. Then you have these major conflagrations that then created this situation. And all of this is detailed in the Facing Fire Building Resiliency to Wildfire 22-minute documentary, of which I'm indebted to the other filmmakers, the editors, the interviewees, the First Nations I met and then went and trained in cultural burning with. But what it really taught me is that when we take a look at fire risk management, we have to take a look at that, it's that old fire triangle, which I think everyone's like, wah, wah. Yeah, I know about that. But it is the basis for all design when it comes to fire management. You've got ignition, you've got fuel, and then you've got oxygen. And if you cut out one of those, fire cannot happen. There's no fuel, there's nothing to burn. If there's no oxygen, there's nothing to burn. If there's no ignition, there's no spark to light. So when we take a look at design, be it from starting from zone 0 out, or if we start from zone 5 from a community perspective and then coming into zone 1 being your home, either way, however it is that the person wants to work, it's a good way to start. And basically what we do within design is we start with high grade topographical information, usually at the 5, 15, or 30 centimeter resolution.
Oh.
Google Earth Pro data is not great data. I don't know if anyone's been talking about this, but I love telling people that you shouldn't base design off of Google Earth. And you shouldn't pay for Google Earth data through some of these contour map generators that are just the same data that basically the shuttle radar topographic mission was the NASA mission that flew around the planet, shot LiDAR, shot lasers down the planet, bounced back, and then they had this 30-meter pixel. And so if you have elevation differences that are 30 meters or less, which most of us do,
right,
that data did the very scientific word of interpolation, which for us is the guessing of if that data, if that topographic information was true. And so there are some map making services that are being sold on the internet right now through companies that are unfortunately that same data, and it's not great data to start off with, and paying for it is just a double hit.
no kidding.
So taking good topographic information, finding good topographic information, flying your own photogrammetry drone set, or taking good survey data from an RTK ground station and a receiver, however it is you get it, you start there, and then you run it through GIS post-processing. And from there, we can get aspect, slope, hill shade. We can get total wetness indicator showing where the rivulets will start and all the different drainages will start within the landscape. We can get total water accumulation. And that then starts the information for us in terms of how does water flow in this landscape? Where is it naturally wet, or where does it naturally want to be wet before there may have been some human or anthropomorphic earthworks that disrupted that? And then from there, it's all about how can we reduce vegetation in areas that are human infrastructure that we want to safeguard. Same way we keep water away from homes, or we advise our clients not to put homes in drainages. Similarly, we're trying to accentuate that water. And Mollison said it best within Permaculture 1 and the Permaculture Designer's Manual, most landscapes should be a third water.
Yeah.
So if they don't have wetlands, if they don't have earthworks, if they don't have water retention landscapes, to borrow Sepp Holzer's phrase, then they need to have some element of that. And that's where some of Sepp's popularized earthworks like hugelkulturs can be exceptional elements for ground fire prevention. Back in 2015, there was a major fire that came very close to our place in British Columbia in Canada. And there was a neighbor 25 clicks down the road that had left this big pile of slash, or it wasn't slash, it was, all the refuse from homesteading. And he also started throwing dirt on it. And so I was watching this kind of giggling to myself that this was going to be an amazing bed eventually. And a couple years go by and 2015 hits, and Jesse, it was wild. The ground fire came right up to the hugel and stopped.
Wow.
And of course, it's a big wet pile
Yeah.
of wood and dirt, right? Hugelkultur is a dug trench with wood that is either already decomposing or very close to, not fresh cut, because the fungicides that are within a tree to make sure that it isn't colonized when it's living need time to dissipate. And then you bury it with dirt, and sometimes you mulch it and sometimes you plant it. But this was amazing to see in real time. Oh, we've got this real life example of how ground fires come up and they completely stop. And this is true as well. I interviewed I forget his name. He's in the documentary, but he was one of the fire chiefs from one of the California fires that year. And he talked about how, gardens make excellent fire breaks. Agriculture makes excellent fire breaks because it's hard to burn a tomato. It's true. Tomatoes are 90% water,
Yep.
and we're irrigating them anyways. These are wet areas usually. And so they had this realization that all of these orchards actually created a fire break around the community. And it was one of these interesting moments that I don't think anyone's followed up on in any big way, but tax breaks or incentivization to create more agricultural hubs around communities. It's what we should be doing anyways, right? We should have a localized, incentivized agri-hoods or food systems that are local to the area, similar to what Havana through hardship had to do after the special period. But that creates a little buffer. And so similarly, you take that concept of, okay, I want a fire break of some way. And again, got to break that fire triangle. So water, wet things will have a hard time burning. They have to dry out first. Hugelkulturs are almost impossible to dry out when they're charged from the winter. So those create really good breaks. So basically, when we're thinking about it, we're taking a look at that mapping conversation. We're seeing that fire usually comes uphill, seldomly goes downhill, but the bigger and bigger fires that we're seeing, especially when that ground fire climbs ladder fuels, gets into the crown. Now it's a crown fire. Now it has what's called an ember front, which is basically because fires at scale can make their own weather systems. They can chuck embers up to 2 kilometers in front of them.
Wow.
And just keep moving. And in Australia, it's worth, there's these firebirds that will pick up sticks and then fly them in different directions, completely making
the agents of chaos.
Yeah, right. Exactly. There you go. Agents of chaos. I like that. Usually that's us.
Yeah, that's our role, birds.
We don't say that about those animals, which we of course are not. So that conversation then becomes, okay, if we're fighting ember fronts, if we're fighting ground fires, and it's really very difficult, if not impossible, to fight a crown fire at full tilt. What then do we do? And so if you start at the home, which a lot of people do, and David Holmgren wrote a whole book about this. He called it the Flywire House, which until a little while ago was still free, but I think the first version may still be. Great book. Everyone should read it. But he really took on the advice of Joan Webster, OEM, who was a nurse before she became a journalist, before she got interested in fire prevention, and then wrote the Bushfire Safety Guide, the Essential and the Bushfire Safety Guide, which became the Bible for fire safety, bushfire in Australian speak, across Australia, and has been credited by the people who survived fires as having saved their lives, their farms, their homes, and their homesteads because of the very simple way that she described it. And making full circle, the Flywire House is this idea of ember infiltration. So most of us have flammable lives. Most of our lives are highly flammable. And with ember infiltration, you get the beginning of the fire, just like if you're around a campfire and the ember comes up and some, gets on your clothes and everyone has a little moment with it. Similarly, you have to be conscientious about ember infiltration. So part of the prevention of that is using flywire metal mesh, to create resistance, to create a bounce back. So that way, all of these little nooks and crannies and all the rest of it, because when embers come in, they can float on air currents. They can still be burning and still be in the air and still have a multitude of vectors that will come in. And so that was one of the very first things that Joan learned about and shared with, and David picked up on and then started to talk about. And then the second thing is being conscientious of how much flammability is around the house. So Joan recommends a 15-meter fire break that's by 3, it's 45-foot fire break around the house. That seems insane to most people because most people want that beautiful specimen tree or that beautiful shrub or that lilac shrub that, middle of summer looks like a pile of tinder and it's right beside the house.
Yeah.
But creating that break then creates a higher possibility that a ground fire, again, we talked about ground fires and crown fires, ground and crown, crown. Crown is at the top of your head, which gets into the actual vegetation in trees and then has its own weather system and draws oxygen and all those things. But within that, as that fire is coming close to the house or the barn or whatever, you have to be conscious about bringing that material close. So high grasses, flammable shrubs, non-irrigated gardens, you want to be conscientious to keep that low down around the house. And this also brings in the idea of prescription fires. So post my training with Trex, the cultural fire management, fire lighting training that was also supported by the Nature Conservancy, we then came back. I came back to Canada because it was held in October. We had winter, flammability is low, except for in the Arctic or in muskeg, where as fires are starting to burn and we're starting to lose that permafrost, fire will actually burrow down into muskeg, stay there all winter long, and then pop up in the spring before anybody knows what's happening. And it happened in Mongolia and Russia a couple of years ago, where fire popped right out of the taiga, the muskeg and the taiga.
It just went into hibernation, kind of, you know?
Well, yeah, it smoldered, right? It just got down into the peat, but had dried out enough and just smoldered there slowly over 6, 7, 8 months, and then popped up, came back up. So another one of those interesting things that are coming up. The other thing that's very interesting is that we're seeing an increase of lightning strikes due to climate variability, and dry lightning strikes are a big factor in lighting wildfires. So as we are getting these larger swings, more energy in the atmosphere, we're getting more lightning strikes, which is kind of interesting as well.
Yeah.
So ground fires coming in, we want to create a break around the house. If we can't create the break, then at the very least, we want to basically lift up the canopy of any of our big story canopy trees, basically to the height of a pole pruner. So as high as you can go is good, because that's going to lift up those ladder fuels, which is how ground fire goes up ladder fuels into crown fire. And then as you get out to the edges, if you can continue that canopy raising, that sort of park-like aspect, then that also reduces the risk of that that fire then coming out and then starting. There's a whole other aspect of this, which is, do you stay and protect your house during wildfire? And generally in North America, it's run away and don't protect. In Australia, it's different. Joan and others, and David, who recently went through a fire, and he talks about it in the documentary, they stayed and they defended their houses. And this was a little thing, we did a webinar, it's on my YouTube channel, All Points Design YouTube channel, with David and with Joan. And they talked about, and it was kind of a quiz to everybody on it. And they said, if you're defending your home, do you face outwards or do you face towards the house? And everyone thought about, and the majority of people said face outwards, but Joan had it. You face the house because that ember front. You face to make sure you spot spray with a backpack sprayer all of the little ember moments that are there.
Yep.
This kind of leads us into vegetative devegetation and the great work of graziers that are bringing in animals like goats, and they're basically dropping that vegetation. And where I started the story, which was after I came back from Trex, we then put fire on the landscape around the house. And there is an ancestral feeling, especially for me being Ukrainian, because we have a history of putting fire on the landscape, of putting fire on when I've been told for years, do not put fire on the landscape. And that's a legacy of coming out of World War II and needing to apply the military and all of its hierarchy and its gear towards stopping wildfires. Now, that's not to say we should let all wildfires go, but the full exclusion of wildfires definitely created the situation we're in today, where a lot of these ecosystems that were supposed to burn haven't burned for 100, 200, 245 years.
Yeah.
Where they're just waiting to burn, to the point to where there is not a feasible, rational approach to reduce that much vegetation. And that's where you really spot around these areas that we're in. And then as you move out from the house, as you're having these direct vectors, for those in permaculture, a sector of wildfire, usually coming upslope, up a ridge, aren't usually in the valleys, but can be if they're dry. They definitely like to go up ridges because, of course, there's more airflow in the ridges,
Yep.
which is one of the reasons, as per keyline design, PA Yeomans found that if you can spread that water out with keyline geometry, the ridges are beautiful because they got full sun, they got full air, full wind, all of those good things. But when it comes to fire, that fire will come up the ridge. And so those areas, we start to do spot treatments. And sometimes that's fire breaks downslope from us. So again, creating that 15-meter, 45-foot break. Sometimes that's creating large hugelkulturs that are then left there. Sometimes that's starting to revegetate slopes with elements like fish scale, straw scales. This was a great application taught to me by Neil Bertrando during the low-tech erosion control course that we put on in regenerative living. Basically, take a shovel, open up the earth, and you take a sheaf of straw from a bale, and you basically set it down in hard to revegetate areas, sprinkle some seeds in there, and basically what happens is you create this little sieve that stops earth from flowing down in highly erosive areas and starts the revegetation process in a very passive way.
Yeah.
So this can be another great way to start revegetation of slopes. And then there's the conversation about starting to revegetate those areas in ephemeral or full-time water bodies. So impoundments of water that can be used downslope to stop spread upslope, and then as high in the landscape as possible for potential fire prevention. So one of the things we've gotten into in design and recommendations is if we can put a pond, as is pretty common and within permaculture regenerative landscape design, as high up as possible. The higher you put up a water body, the more potential it has, the best battery, we like to say.
Right.
But it also has a correlation in terms of the PSI. So it's usually 41% of the height in feet is going to be your PSI. So 100 feet, 41 PSI, basically domestic, which is really important if you are interested in leaving the house and you want something that's there that might support it. So we've worked with and developed and designed systems where we've got the water that has a siphon, a ready-made siphon that comes into the pond, comes down to the house, and then is fed directly into rooftop sprinklers that have a heat valve that will then open up and then completely engulf the house in water.
Wow.
Now, what a lot of people think is, well, I've got a pump, or I've got this, or I've got electricity. Number one thing to realize is in a wildfire, electricity gets turned off. It's too much of a hazard. So they turn that off. You don't have access to that. So you have to think about that in terms of how will my prevention or my mitigation look like in those situations. And that's one of the easier ways to do it. Having pumps, having all of the materials, the hose, attachments, all of that in ready-made conversations, good maintenance, making sure the bug out bags and everything else are set. It's basically plan Bs are only plan Bs if you plan them and practice them. If they're not that, then they're just an idea. They're just a pie in the sky idea. So that's another aspect that we do within our design conversation. And then we basically just chart everything on a landscape just to show all the areas that we would want to mitigate against. And this was one of the things that David talks about in the documentary, is that they've been revegetating this this little creek out back with willows. And it's wild to watch, Jesse. Like, the fire comes up to the willows and stops. Why? Because willows are full of water. This is not a very dry plant. When it does get dry, it's a problem for everybody because it's an indicator. But that's another one of those big things to be conscientious of, is we have so beaten up our watersheds, our drainages, our wetlands, that when there's an opportunity to increase them, to amplify them, to improve upon them, allow them to be developed. If the beaver comes and wants to start, he sees a stream of water and he goes, not on my watch, and he dams it up and he makes his lodge and extends that wet area. Take a moment to see, how can I accentuate versus how can I demonize this animal, and how can I work with it? That isn't to say that it's not always going to be the case in all situations, but we should be, from an ecological standpoint, thinking how can we work with these ecological agents first and foremost, instead of how can we force function our idea of a landscape in all situations. And it's the same thing with fire protection. Well,
Yeah.
that seems like a very long ramble, and I should probably pause
It
for
well, it
questions.
was a magnificent ramble. I really enjoyed it. And well, you touched on all the things. So let's break down a couple here. If I'm a homesteader, one of the
Yeah.
things I'm going to want to be considering is how I'm going to physically protect my own home.
Yeah.
So that could be the fly wire conversation. That could be the backpack sprayers. That could be the 45-foot break. Though I agree with you, especially from the permaculture perspective of like zone designing. You want your gardens up close to the house, you know, like you want your beauty up close to the house. So that seems a little, that might be a tough sell to have 45 feet of maybe nothing or just a break. But then you also said that gardens kind of act as a break as long as they're watered well and potentially bordered by, you know, things like willows or bordered by a hugelkultur sort of mounds or something like that. That could be another way to deal with the mitigation factor. And then another key piece is on the wilder landscape, zones 4, zone 5, to pull out some of that refuse that's laying down, that tinder that's just in weight. And to me, it seems pretty obvious. Put it into a hugelkultur bed. Those are effective anyway, and you can boundary the part of the yard or part of the landscape that maybe the fire is going to be going toward with hugelkultur beds. So that's kind of a whole, like, if I own the house. Now there's the other piece which is more critical to me and seems more sensible to me, which is what about your whole neighborhood? What about your whole town? Because you're all in a fire zone. What about if we get folks together? You know, if you're watching this out there and you want to find Javin's documentary, where can people find that, by the way?
Yeah, it's the All Points Design YouTube channel. If you just type in "facing fire, building resiliency to wildfire" into YouTube, it'll pop up.
Okay. And then there's the Flywire House, David Holmgren's sort of resource. There's multiple resources. Maybe we could get together and have a watch party or a discussion party, because then you open up the idea of like, okay, where are we going to put a pond for the community, not just for my home? Where are we going to build riparian zones, or what dead tinder area are we going to tackle first, or how are we going to introduce burning onto the landscape in a sensible way? And so that piece really seems critical to me. And I'll just throw out there, since we're chatting about that PINA did FERP, which is Fire Ecology Restoration Project, which was very much a biochar based solution. So they would go out and with these portable kilns into, you know, fire ecologies and take some of that sort of dead dry tinder and turn it into biochar, and then spread the biochar sort of through trenching and through like where the fire might move to build that sort of water holding lens within the landscape there. So that's another thing. And then Pina has produced educational material about that. I think a documentary that was like 20-30 minutes. So I'm just wondering, and maybe you can riff on this, Javin, if you're thinking more community scale, what if about grabbing all these pieces and getting some folks together and just discussing like where do we want to go as a community? None of us want to lose our house due to fire. So what can we do together? Have you had experience with people thinking like that? What would you advise?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll throw out a few more resources here. One is allpointsdesign.ca/facing fire. I collated as much resources as I'd come into as I was developing the documentary for reference. The other one here is the Multinational Exchange for Sustainable Agriculture, the MESA.
Okay.
And they did a fire resiliency online course for farmers, which was excellent.
Oh, cool.
And I believe it's still free. So it's a great resource if folks are serious about looking at it. They might have been a bit prescriptive in it, but I'd rather that than nothing at all. So I can highly recommend that. A couple of colleagues were part of that course. And then in terms of defensible space and wild fire smart, which are the American and the Canadian resources respectively, in terms of starting to build resiliency, those are two that are quite good. The only major communities that have been able to defend against wildfire in the Pacific Northwest and then the western coast of California were communities that got together and they saw and they planned from, again, and we started about zone 0 out or zone 5 starting at community in.
Yeah.
Very first thing we talked about. When you start at community level, you do a few things. One, you acknowledge that all of you are part of something bigger, which I think inherently is the permaculture conversation that we're trying to move people towards.
Yeah.
The second is you realize that you're much stronger in mass. You know, the bundle of sticks is much stronger than the single stick. And you have similar mindsets that are working throughout the community. So right before I left the place I was living before, we had a few fire conscious folks. And so we had little burn parties going along the roadway to remove some of the vegetative material that had massed, and started to build plans off of the end of the barbecue that happened afterwards.
Nice.
So it was, as the fire is going down, we're all learning how to put fire on the landscape, we're watching things. Fire department was notified. They came out a few times. They're like, you guys know what you're doing, which tells you you're in the sticks a little bit, because they don't usually do that. They like to be there with like 12 trucks. They're just waiting for a moment to put that out. But the nice thing is that when you're putting low fire on the landscape, you need a rake, really. Like, that's the tool we use most often. Very seldom, like, I thought about getting a drip torch, which is the common way of putting fire in a landscape in a prescription way. But, you know, truthfully, you light a pitched piece of wood and you roll it around with a rake, and that's the speed you want to be working at this level. This is not big fire.
Right.
But that conversation creates community connection. It creates conversation, and it creates awareness. We talked about this actually in the business conversation. Awareness is prerequisite for change, and that's true in all things. So that then allows people to create plans, and in terms of making sure neighbors are okay if something's going on. So that then created a plan of, okay, what are you doing? I'm going to talk to so-and-so, so-and-so is going to talk to me. We're going to have a third, and that's the triangle. And then it moves to somebody else. And each triangle is a part of 3 other triangles. So everybody has this redundancy and triplicate. And then if you had animals, there was a conversation about where the animals were going to go. So very quickly, know where your animals are going to go before the fire hits.
Yes.
This is true for birds. This is true for smaller livestock, your pigs, your goats, your sheep, getting into larger livestock, into your cows, bison, yaks. It's really understanding where they're going to go, what happens. And if they're going to fend for themselves, that's a viable solution, but they also have to have space to do so. And generally, low, shallow water they can walk into, which they do naturally, if that's the case. And it's all tied in. This goes back to empowerment conversations. You need to have a ramp that goes into your water bodies. It can't just be deep on all sides, but you also have to have layers within your water body to resist evaporation. So that way there is some water circulation as well. So each one of these layers in on each other. But the community thing was one of my favorite parts of it, because you got to share and talk, and you got to know your neighbors a little bit better. Because once you are getting into a state of potential catastrophe, there's a different mindset you adopt, and you see each other differently. You see each other as assets instead of potential liabilities. It's very interesting. It's one of the only times I've seen that happen in hosting community for the last 16 years. I definitely wasn't into community before I took my first PDC. I was like, yeah, let's have a potluck. Let's play video games, or let's play board games when I was younger. But really, sports, but developing reciprocal, compassionate relationships that are endemic and naturalized to your area, where you understand the situation you are in, and you can develop resiliency within that, I think is the beginning of so much of the community building, the invisible structures that we talk about. So in many ways, fire prevention can be a gateway drug to community in a way that very few other things have been, in my experience, after hosting 3 different permaculture groups, starting a permablitz network, hosting a bunch of bachakachas and presentation nights, trying to gather people around. It's like, talk about what are you going to do when there's a fire? People start to show up because there's self-interest at heart.
Yeah. Well, there's something so deep about that. I was reading the book Tribe. I forget the guy's name who wrote that. You may have read that book, but he writes about, like, in World War II and in World War I, when catastrophe happens, people show up in a different way and bond. It's like brotherhood in war, right? Like, you go to war together and you're forever bonded, and nothing ever matches that experience, because you really needed to have each other's back. You really, really needed it. Barring that, it's just sort of like, it's sort of like a ephemera, or it's some sort of like conditional thing that, like, oh, I can go, but I don't have to go. And I think aside from fire, I think another thing is like the pandemic or like food shortage. That would do the same thing. It would galvanize folks around a very real, like, hey, we need each other's back here. and who's got
Mhm.
what assets, who has what skills, let's work together, stronger together than apart sort of idea. Interesting in that book too, mental health, people who are in psych wards with schizophrenia during the war, during the bombing, would come out into the street totally coherent and able to help one another, no longer
Mhm.
meeting the criteria of schizophrenia, which is like says a lot about the conditionality of, impending doom. And like, we actually need to show up right now. Many issues go away in a society when we're in those moments. So those are just my reflections. Javin, you were going to share something with us, I think. So why don't we share screen real quick, and then we'll close things down. This is a great
Yeah.
primer. Obviously, we could go for hours and hours on the whole idea of designing these and implementing. The other thing I'll say as you're pulling that up is, for permaculture design and install businesses, this is something that you can be a part of educating folks, but also not every homesteader or town is going to have the skills to sort of install these things that we're talking about. So you can really take a lead in both education and helping folks get the on the ground sort of systems in place.
It's definitely a tool. It's a community fire. Yeah, it's a campfire, community campfire that draws around the conversation. And as we were talking about yesterday in business, anything that can be a hub that you can bring people in that might have a like-minded conversation. If you become skilled in fire mitigation design, it can be a place to bring people to a presentation, a conversation, and then can increase your reputation around your design business. So I think you're spot on there. So this is a recent design in the Pacific Northwest that I just wanted to showcase a little bit in terms of the design process and conversation that then helps us to kind of take a look at how we might start to design this and kind of see this in the broader spectrum.
Yeah.
So this is a site that's just on the north side of a little town, and in this little site, you can already see some of the drainages. So on the north side, we've got a pretty large drainage, and this is mostly a northwest and eastern facing slope. So most drainages are coming off of this Pacific Northwest, usually pretty wet anyways. So we got really good topographic information, had a digital elevation model, which is like taking a thin piece of silk and just draping it over a landscape so you can see all the different topographical changes. And if you're using LiDAR, that silk can basically go through the trees like they're invisible and go right down to the ground, which is the information we were able to gather. And then we developed 10-foot 10-foot contours, and I think for the majority of the populace here that'll be useful. But we also did metric, only because anybody who's ever done any rainwater harvesting or water catchment analysis, metric's the way to go. So once you do that, then if you're working with clients, you really want to help them to see what they're looking at. And so getting a sense of that hillshade is useful because then they see it, right? It pops out to them. They can see the drainage, they can see the shapes and the forms of what we're looking at here. And then from there, we start to develop a number of different types of maps off of that. So we develop an aspect map. An aspect map gives us a sense of what are all the different roof surfaces, if you will, of a landscape that then show us what's the east, what's the north, what's the west, and really gives us a sense in terms of that aspect of how much is facing west, how much is facing south, how much is facing east. And if you're familiar with aspect, then you know that southern's the most powerful, western's the second, eastern's the third, and north is the fourth most powerful. So, and so you also know your hot spots, which is
Yeah.
important when you're doing this type of design. That then leads to, for those of us that work in keyline design, what are our ridges, what are our valleys, and then what we call our primary land units, so this area in between. And we can calculate that rain potential, that rainwater catchment, and we can know how much water we could potentially sink into that area, which then informs what kind of fire prevention implementations we might be using. That then leads us into slope in both degree and percentage. So slope in terms of degree and percentage gives us a sense of, and I think it's the 1.0 we wanted to use there, gives us a sense of the go, no go zones for cultivation. So on some of our slope categories, we're not going to do anything there because it's too steep, and others we will. And because I work with the regenerative Agrarian's platform, they go even further into cultivation zones. So that then gives us a sense of, okay, if we're not going to cultivate in these red zones, but these could be big potential issues in terms of fire coming up, what then are we going to do there? So it also kind of classifies the landscape and what we may or may not do.
Mhm.
That's capabilities. We already talked about that. Of course, we wouldn't be doing permaculture if we didn't do our zones. So, we've got our existing zones there. We've got our projected zones. We'll turn off 5 so we can see what we might be looking at. That then is really a priority in terms of what we're protecting. We're going to be protecting our zone 1, 2, and 3. So we want to be highly conscientious of this issue. This is a very wet bottom boundary. This is a very low, currently today, a very low risk situation. But the moment you get into climate change predictions, regardless of what you think about it, taking a look at the Copenhagen predictions, the A1, F1, IPCC predictions, this landscape's going to go wet and hot, and then it's going to go hot and dry, kind of at the 35, 40-year mark. So a lot of the decisions we're making about this landscape are 50 to 100 years in the future. Sector analysis, pretty self-explanatory for most people. I like throwing a compass on just so that way I can keep those angles from the different data we're looking at. And really for this, our fire sectors, if we turn off everything else, our fire sectors were eastern and really western, because this area here had a little bit of a break, but we'd already accounted for it with something else. So that worked out. Those of you that work with or understand polar sun paths and also Cartesian sun paths gives us a sense of the solar path, which again takes a look at hot spots. And something else that I don't think a lot of people know that they can do, which is kind of a fun thing to talk about, is we have this ability to bring in geo-reference photos into Google Earth Pro, which is one of the reasons I love using it. Plus the fact that it's accessible, plus the fact that it's free, plus the fact that I can pass on this documentation to the client directly and they can use it, is when we have these photo marks, folks can go out. If you're working with iOS, it's called GPS Kit, the application. If you're using Android, it's called Gaia GPS. And you can go and take photos specifically of areas, and you can reference the density of this forest. Look how dense this forest is. Like, you go through this and you're just like, this is, the permeability is very low, which means that the potential for ground fire and crown fire is high, although it's currently wet here. So we're thinking in the future there.
Right.
So that's something to keep in mind, because you can bring it into Google Earth Pro. And then we've got our catchment and our watershed. So we kind of want to know what's called the total wetness indicator. Where are those rills and runnels? Where are those drainages? Where might we want to be looking at? So this is taking the inversion of the contours. And then also the catchment area. These are one of my favorite maps because it shows us what's the total catchment that's coming in and through this landscape. So we can then multiply that by the yearly, we can multiply the yearly annual precept, we can multiply that by the coefficient, and we can get a sense of what might be draining through that we could use. So that all then comes into what are we doing for design? So the house, if we start with the house and move outwards, the house, the desired potential house location is going to be roughly here. So we know we need to guard and design against that. So as we go back into this conversation of ponds and dams and whatnot, what we're really trying to do is get that above. So that way we can have some potential for either gravity fed. We want to make sure it's not directly above the house, because if it fails, there's an issue. This is one of 3 potential locations that will be evaluated due to test slices come the spring. So we want to be sure about that. That becomes a part of the conversation as well. We have a riparian zone we're not going to touch, so that's good to know what we're not going to be working on. It's always nice to know that. Access. So talking about access for a second, access is your #1 potential for getting out of a fire. And if you only have singular access, it's a major weakness, almost a threat for a site. So if you can potentially punch through, even if it's a quick escape route, something happens over here, it's good to have the other escape route, and then keeping your access clean and clear, making sure that we don't have any growth that's coming up through, as can happen in farms and homesteads. So a really important piece on the tracks. Also understanding where the major utilities are coming in, because there's chances of fire through that. So one of the things you might have seen with that contour dam, because it may go someplace on this swale, we also have a wetted area near where there might be potential down lines. So that was a redundancy we put in there. Ecosystems is important, and ecoregions is important to know, just so that way we know what kind of plants we're working with. And then we get into the shelter belt. So there's shelter belts here, and then there's buffers in between, and the roads play a great role within the buffers for this landscape. We don't actually have to put in huge amount of buffers, but once we get into the different areas, staging area for material, shrub layer, the different vegetative layers and the different terraces, all of those things, and what we designed in there, which was mostly hugelkultur or hugelkultur lined beds. This was all to increase the resiliency of this landscape. And then, of course, the landscaping. And the biggest thing here was this was all fire prevention. So all of this here was where we were raising canopy, where we were reducing vegetative infiltration, increasing permeability. So that way, all of this had reduced capacity in terms of the ability to burn. And this is really that last piece, plus a whole feasibility study that talked about how they would take that water, how they would apply it on the house, how they would apply it where they're going, what is their exit strategy. That all becomes a full design for them to understand, how are we going to respond to living with fire with a flammable life?
Yeah. Beautiful. That really articulates it very well with the visual representation here. So that's perfect, Gavin. Well, it's about that time, my friend. I think we did it again. We did a full other presentation. I appreciate you joining us here and speaking on this. Obviously, this is just a primer on the whole issue of fire and fire design for mitigation. What would you leave folks with in terms of, you left some good resources, but if they have their own business and they're in fire-prone landscapes, what might you leave folks with by way of saying, like, next steps for a design install firm to take on this whole fire mitigation piece?
Yeah, I think the one thing we talked about yesterday, mileage may vary and context is king, is so important. There are in some situations where putting fire in the landscape makes zero sense. There's some landscapes where doing hugelkulturs makes zero sense. These are all different techniques and processes to apply to the landscape. And one of the biggest gripes I have about permaculture and the teaching of it is it becomes a grocery store where people just grab things off the shelf, slam it onto a landscape and call it done. Here's the herb spiral, here's the hugelkultur, it's a permaculture design. It's not. We need to systematically respond to the biotic and abiotic factors of a landscape, plus the circles of design, the first circle of inherent characteristics, regulatory climate. We live in a regulatory climate. We best know what it is, and then client needs and wants. And that middle is the sweet spot. So become interested in fire ecology. Payne, Stephen Payne's books about fire and fire ecology are exquisite. The Facing Fire documentary is a great, quick appetizer primer about this conversation. Mesa does a beautiful free course, which I highly recommend. Essential Bushfire Techniques Management, I'm gapping on the name of it, by Joan Webster, is an exquisite book that we can translate pretty quickly over into North America, and would love to see a rewriting of that. And then if you are wanting to design or wanting to learn about the process of the conversation, reach out. I love working with people or consulting with people one-on-one. If you want to learn process and conversations, it's a nice thing to add in. And I am in talks with David Holmgren and Joan Webster to potentially offer a fire design course about how to look at fire and how to get into that conversation. But, in many ways, I don't know if I would, because that Mesa course is really great. I know it's geared towards farmers, but it's a free resource. It's great. It goes step by step.
Yeah.
I think it's brilliant. So I think they've done a great job. So that's where I would say and start with, and just realize that not all these situations, or not everything I talked about is going to be true. So if you're having a knee-jerk reaction like, well, that's garbage, that doesn't work in my area, probably. Sure. Yeah. 100%. David hates the idea of putting fire on the landscape due to the carbon conversation. And I look at it in a bigger picture, in a bigger lens from a North American perspective, in terms of small fire in small areas can actually be the perfect tool at the perfect time, similar to what Alan Savory talks about as fire being one of, if not the only tool we've ever had. So I would say start there. And don't be afraid to start to get to know fire. It's actually a beautiful, brilliant part of our evolution that we've all co-evolved in. And it's a really beautiful a path to walk down and to learn about.